Mox here, in disguise today as we go undercover to examine
The cult of Wing Chun.
Now, this phenomena of cults is not exclusive to Wing Chun. The same criticisms could be made about many traditional martial arts. But for the purposes of making the threats against me more manageable, I'm going to aim my comments here mainly at
The cult of Wing Chun.
Now, in an earlier video, I said that our Wing Chun community is sometimes guilty of arrogance, acting as though we are the only ones with some scientific principles in our art. And yet at the same time as we, beat our chests about our science, we take the opposite of the scientific method in acquiring our skills and knowledge. Healthy skepticism gives way to unhealthy adulation and blind following, like in a cult. And it's not just the thinking that gets affected, but the actual training and hence effectiveness too. So this happens more in traditional martial arts such as Wing Chun than, boxing. Why is this so? And what can we do to crush these cults? Well, Morty, I'm glad you asked. But first, we need to travel to the alternate dimension in which most martial arts cults operate. And here we are. Now, some of you may recognize this place, as this series of videos have achieved a kind of cult following all of their own online. Why? Well, for some it's because it's like the ultimate skins versus shirts game, or more like 100 malnourished skins versus the guy in the shirt and suit who got all their meals instead. But the weirdness isn't just in what they wear, or don't wear. No, the weirdness must have seeped into the water as well, because just check out some of the symptoms of the afflicted here. What do we got? Uncontrollable shakes, loss of muscle control, complete lack of credibility. You name it, they got it. Now, I'm not playing this clip just to make fun of a specific style or a specific school, but I did choose this clip because this school did not start out like this. They didn't start with a 5-point palm exploding heart technique. In my opinion, they started out pretty good. And if you check out some of their earlier videos, their techniques look pretty good and sharp. But the thing is, you see, no one wakes up one day and says, I just want to join a cult. Well, maybe the cosplayers at Comic-Con do. But other than them, no one sets out to join a cult. It often just happens without you really noticing. So what are some of the ways to spot a martial arts cult? Well, first and foremost, the master and his skills. And yeah, it's always a he. The master and his skills are ridiculously revered, often referred to in awed, hushed tones. One time Chuck Norris came to take lessons from the master, but Chuck wasn't good enough for our beginner class. But the master rarely spends his time training with or even speaking to any of his students. Only higher levels have this privilege of stepping behind the curtain to speak directly to the great and all-powerful Oz. Now, the master maintains his mystique through periodic demonstrations of his potency. But in these demonstrations, you'll very likely see one or more of these three things. 1. The opponent will be much smaller or weaker than the master. Even without the 5-point palm exploding heart technique, your money's going to be on the big guy, right? 2. The opponent freezes after one move, while the master gets to do 5 or 6 or 20 moves, just like in real life. 3. Normal laws of physics or science or common sense don't apply, ever. So you can spot a cult quite easily, but how does Wing Chun descend to this cult-like level? Well, as they say, the fish rots from the head. So things start at the very top, with us teaching today. Now, I'm greatly simplifying things here, but hey, this isn't a brief lecture. It's a YouTube video, and according to analytics, about 80% of you stopped watching 4 minutes ago. So I'm just going to go for it here. In my view, the conditions that give rise to the cult are to be found in a precise mix of culture and traditions. And yeah, I happen to be one that promotes martial arts culture and traditions, and I continue to support them. But not all of them. You see, I think the fault in many traditional martial arts isn't in the effectiveness of their martial arts, but rather in some of the traditions tied to them. It isn't necessarily the martial arts that need to be updated to meet the needs of modern times, but rather the traditions. Now, I was born and raised in Asia. And if you go back just one generation, you'll see how rooted in the past much of Asia is. Now, I'm not saying that a generation ago the West was woke, nor do I think that the West is some enlightened utopia right now. But in certain aspects, it has evolved more than the rest of the world. Again, generalizing a lot here. But within my own extended family, I can clearly recall the blatant racism, sexism, almost tender embrace of all forms of discrimination to keep traditions alive, they would say. And why? Because the elders did it, so that's how we're going to do it. Respect your elders and respect for your teachers. That's something that was so sacred that to even think of debating the issue would be sacrilegious. Unquestioning aping and adoption of ancient practices was not only expected, it was demanded. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. You'd hear that a lot. Don't question, just do as you're told, especially from those older than you. And in fairness, the respect of these old elders is deserved. Those teachers went through incredibly hard times. War, disease, famine. They put in decades of hard work and toil to earn the experience and skills that they shared with you. You know, I remember watching an interview with Jackie Chan some time ago, and in it he said, maybe it's no longer possible to develop skills the way that he did. You know, because he started at 6 years old, and it was brutal. Lots of beatings and harsh punishment. It's illegal to treat adults that way now, you know, let alone kids. So the old ways and old days, we may not want to repeat all of that, but they are deserving of respect nonetheless. I'm not looking to rewrite the past or fault the old generation of teachers, you know, constrained by culture and bound by their own codes and with no exposure to other teaching approaches. What they did was right for their times. But if you want to continue some of those practices today, maybe twist them further, say things like turning respect for your teachers because they have deepened knowledge and experience, and you turn that into pay your fees and give me blind obedience because I have little more experience than you, but I don't want you to focus on that. To accept in an unquestioning fashion the teaching of someone who doesn't have decades of daily practice behind them, but more likely they have 10 years or less of part-time practice? To blindly accept all of what that person says? This happens, but it should not. It's not healthy in Wing Chun. It's not healthy in any field of human endeavour. Look, teachers are getting younger, and there's not a requirement that teachers be old. In fact, youthful teachers can bring some benefits. But with youth comes some risks. Older teachers have the opportunity to have matured more. They can, but not always will. They can have tamed their ego. And this is something that most young men struggle with. And the arrest and assault statistics of any city on a Saturday night, they're going to show how younger guys struggle to curb their egos, responding violently to any perceived challenge to it. But hey, if you're young and want to open a Wing Chun school, good for you. There's no licensing requirement and you're free to do whatever you like. But what is your end goal? If those goals revolve around you, your needs and your ego, rather than the needs of your students, then teaching shouldn't be your profession. And that applies to young teachers and to old ones. Because if you start out with yourself as the focus, perhaps without meaning to, you're laying the groundwork for a cult. Because everything is centered on you. Because everything revolves around you, and deep down you're worried about looking bad in front of your students. Even though you have less experience than your own teacher, you're probably not going to admit what you don't know. So what happens then? You just start making things up. Or you suggest that you've discovered new forms and techniques. Or other guys, they claim to have rediscovered lost forms. And because your focus is solely on you, the modest mindset of the past that said, I can never be better than my own teacher, now that gets corrupted into, my students are not allowed to be better than me. Well, enter the cult. And with that mindset, the art dies. Because if each generation of teachers fears their students surpassing them, how does a style do anything but degrade? Teachers that are afraid of their students becoming better than them, they can easily hide behind tradition. Yeah, you hit me, but that's not the proper way. Or they can hide behind pseudoscience. Yeah, you hit me, but your force wasn't generated from the correct engine. So you see, it doesn't count. Or they can just hide. Period. You see, the master does not touch hands with juniors, or those that are paid less than 2 years' fees, because his force would be just too deadly for you. You know, I've heard all of these excuses. And here's an example of where this leads. Again, you may recognize this clip too. I was doing the rounds earlier this year, and from a lot of comments that I read about it, most thought it was great. It was a great example of an arrogant student getting what he deserved for daring to challenge his senior. It's not how I view it. See, I know that on any day, anybody can hit anybody. Now, consistently hitting someone, well, that's a different matter. But everyone can and will occasionally hit. If you're genuinely trying and you're training hard and often enough, no one is untouchable. And if either you or your students think that you are, you're cultivating a cult. Maybe the truth actually is that you're only untouchable because your students are too afraid of the consequences of pointing out flaws in your defense, just like in this clip here. And if that's the case, both you and your students are on a slippery slope downwards. Now, staying alert to this downward slope is not easy, and it means swallowing your pride regularly. And no one likes doing that, and it's something that I have to do regularly. And I'm no one. I don't really even have a name or reputation to protect. But I still have to fight my ego regularly to check the need to look good in front of my students. You know, earlier this year, I was demonstrating something in front of the class, and the student who was helping me, he interrupted me and he said, actually, you're mostly just pushing me with your arm muscle, and I'm strong enough to stop that. And yeah, inside I was annoyed, embarrassed like hell too, because he was right. You see, I could feel that as I was talking and explaining, I wasn't actually executing my technique correctly. But I didn't want to admit my mistake in front of everyone and start all over again, so I just kept going. And most students, realizing that you're teaching, tend to be forgiving. They go along with it. They want you to look good because, they've chosen to train with you, and if you look good in front of others, then it reflects well upon them and their choices. There are all these complex social rules at work, even in a training hall. But you see, you as the teacher need to steer things away from those social niceties. Hey, after all, in fighting and self-defense, you're dealing with antisocial behavior and non-compliant actors. So as awkward as I felt, I smiled at my student, thanked him for pointing it out, and started all over again. Now, after the class, this student came up to me privately and apologized for pointing out publicly my mistake. I stopped him right away, and I told him I was grateful, and that if I can't demonstrate a technique and talk at the same time, then heck, I need to practice the technique more. Or stop talking, but hey, that ain't gonna happen. I thanked him and told him how valuable and precious his actions were, because that is what keeps a cult from developing. And why, for as long as he retains that same honest, incorruptible approach, he can expect me to call on him for demonstrations all the time. Now, of course, this student was merely being honest and skeptical. He wasn't just, being disruptive or trying to prove a point or anything like that. Now, that does happen sometimes. Someone will come to your school not to learn, but to challenge you under the pretext of learning. But as a teacher, you should have the experience and maturity not to lump everyone all together and to treat them differently. As a teacher, I remind myself to smile and congratulate my students every time they find a way through my defenses and training. because they're supposed to do that. To just lash out in anger is to discourage growth. By punishing your students for revealing your flaws don't disappear. They only get wider and deeper over time as they get pushed deep down. And if the culture of the school revolves around making you look good, more and more compliance is required from your students. So the cult becomes more and more entrenched. So, while I remain committed to the traditions and culture of traditional martial arts, the one explicit change I believe in is to demand that my students be better than me, and for them to keep pushing me until they achieve just that. Because that way I know that I'm growing and developing, and thus the whole school is growing and developing. Because we learn from our mistakes, and that's how we improve. So if suddenly none of your students can lay a hand on you, it's not because you've stopped making mistakes or that you've got nothing left to learn. That's probably not true. But it will be true that you are no longer learning. And it's way too early for that, don't you think?